Right now, it is my pleasure to introduce our last panelist, Bill Caruth. Bill is a member of the Board of Trustees of Nita Stewart Haley Memorial Library and History Center, as well as the Hillcrest Foundation and the International Linguistics Center in Dallas. He's chairman of the Board of Advisors for the Institute for Studies and Identification Technologies, and chairman of the board of the Graduate Institute of Applied Linguistics in Dallas, and also the Free Market Foundation. He's also a National Center for Policy Analysis Senior Fellow, a nationally recognized expert and lecturer on firearms and gun control, and has co-authored several firearms-related studies. But what he's here to talk to us about today is the reproduction of the Goodnight-Loving Trail map. As a little bit of background, we talked a little bit yesterday. Bill was going through some records here at the library, and he found the map and decided that it'd be a great idea to reproduce it so that more people could have access to it. He had no idea what a great adventure he was about to undertake, but that's what he's here to talk about, not me. So, Bill Caruth.
And I'm going to stay here and not turn my back to this lady at all. It is tough to go last because some of the folks have said some things like you did about what I was going to talk about on the trail from no, you didn't say anything about it. But after the 1860s war, there was no money in Texas, so Colonel Goodnight decided that he was going to try and sell some cattle somewhere else where they did have some money. And instead of going north, he went west. He thought he would try and drive the cattle out into New Mexico and maybe up into the Colorado area, because the Army had gathered together all the Navajos and the Apaches out at Fort Sumner, and they were needing food for them. He headed west on the drive that they were talking about before, a magnificent drive. Just, you can't imagine the difficulties he had, and if you want to read about it, you ought to read the Goodnight biography. The first year when he blazed the trail, he had all the difficulties of drought and weather and the typical things you might have on such a great drive, but at least the Indians didn't bother him, and he was the only one on the trail. The next year, though, because when he got through over there in Fort Sumner, he sold his cattle for 8 cents a pound on the hoof, and he said he made more money than he'd ever made before in his life in the cattle business. So he came right back and put together another herd and headed out the next year. That year, though, he was not the only one on the trail, because other people had heard about what he had done the year before, and there were a lot of cattle on that trail that year, and the Indians had heard about it too, and there wasn't a single cattle herd that went up the trail that didn't get hit by the Indians a few times. As he was going up into New Mexico, it was getting late in the season, and Loving was concerned about they might not be able to get much of a price for their cattle. So he wanted to go on ahead to try and arrange a sale, and Goodnight said, "Don't do that. The Indians will catch you if you go out there." And Loving was very impatient, just really had to go. So Goodnight finally relented and said, "All right, if you will promise to go at night and not travel during the daytime." And he sent with him one of his best hands, a one-armed cowboy named Bill Wilson. They headed out, and for the first couple of nights, yes, they went at night, and they had no trouble. And then Loving said, "All right, I've had enough of this nighttime. I got to get there. We got to start traveling during the daytime." Besides that, we haven't seen any sign of Indians at all. They headed out, and wouldn't you know, as they were going across the plains, there were a whole bunch of Indians, 100 or so, according to some stories, came down off the mountains, chased them, and they ran as fast as they could and got down to the Pecos River and got down on the river bottom. The bank was steep enough that they could get under the bank, and there was a little notch there in the bank so they could get up. So the only way you could get to them was to shoot from a bank on the other side of the river. And when the Indians tried to get over there, Loving would shoot them, and that discouraged them pretty well. Loving had a special weapon, which was new to the plains at the time, because most of the people at that time were still shooting muzzle loaders. But he had a Henry rifle. Now, this was the first rifle that Winchester made. Now, you may wonder why it's called a Henry rifle, because Winchester made it. That's because Winchester was a shirt maker, and he wasn't sure if these rifles were ever going to catch on, so he named it after his foreman, Mr. Henry. The next one he brought out, he figured it was all right, so he named that the Winchester rifle. But this thing would shoot 15 times without having to reload it. Everybody else was stuffing stuff down the barrel from the front end and having to load it that way. This thing, you just lever a new one in and shoot it. This way you could hold off a whole lot more Indians than you could otherwise. So the two of them were holding off the Indians. Then the Indians claimed they wanted a parley. Wilson said, don't do that. Well, Loving got up there to talk to the guys about it, and the Indian shot him, went through his arm and into his side, and he was sure he was killed. But he still survived, and that night he convinced Wilson to leave and swim away downstream, get his clothes off and swim downstream to try and go get help. Thought Goodnight couldn't be far behind with a herd, and would he bring it up there soon? Well, Wilson headed down the stream, and he figured out pretty quick that one-armed man cannot swim too good carrying a rifle. So he stashed the rifle down underneath the bank there and took off down the stream, managed to get past the Indians and came out of the stream. And what he didn't know was that Goodnight was not right behind him. He had stopped to water the herd for a couple of days and was several days down the way. And if you know that part of country around New Mexico, a man with no shoes, no shirt, and no pants is in bad shape down there. He was trying to walk across that land, and after about 3 days, he was hived up in a cave when they did get together with a herd. He told Goodnight what had happened. Goodnight went up to see what had happened to Loving, and he found the place where the attack had been, but Loving was not there. He assumed that, well, all right, the Indians must have got him, and he was gone. Actually, Loving had survived, had managed to sneak away after a couple of days, wounded as he was. He hadn't died of the wound, and had got some traders to carry him back to Fort Sumner. When Goodnight got to Fort Sumner, he found that Loving was alive and actually seemed to be getting better. The arm was giving him some trouble, but the wound in his side was healing up. The arm got septic, and they had to amputate the arm. Later on, the amputation didn't work well. It started to bleed, and they had to make a second operation. And from then on, Loving went downhill, and he died. But this was after some period of time. And in his final moments there, he was talking to Goodnight and said, look, I do not want to be buried in this foreign country. I want you to take me back to Texas. And Goodnight said, I will do that. And that winter, Goodnight went up to Colorado to found another ranch up there. And in the spring, though, he came back to Fort Sumner. And they dug up the body. And then they found and built a bigger box, and he found every tin can in town and cut it apart and then soldered it together around this big box, put the coffin inside the big box and filled the interseam space with charcoal. Then they took the bed off a wagon, put that big box up on the wagon, and took him back to Texas. And if you think that sounds a little bit like Lonesome Dove, yeah, it does. That's where McMurtry got it, but he didn't give Mr. Haley any credit. Mr. Goodnight, of course, lived to be in his 90s, as we mentioned here before, and was interviewed at length by Mr. Haley. And they drew this map of exactly where he'd gone, and has notations along there about where the fight took place and the 97 miles without water and lost 300 head and all sorts of interesting things on the map, and then the notations around the side. And we found this map back in the records here. It was in pretty bad shape. As you can imagine, I don't know what the maps in your glove compartment look like, but after you fold them and unfold them enough times, where they used to be creases, there are holes and there are torn edges. And well, this was all like that, and even worse because it came from the 1920s and was real brittle. So it was very, very fragile. We thought it would be a really good thing to display and maybe share with some other people. And how do we make it right? Because we wanted to fill in the gaps and make it look better. Well, we do live in the digital age. So the idea was that we would get this thing scanned digitally and then go in and fill in all the gaps and redo it and take out the blemishes and things like that. But my scanner is about that size, and most everybody else that I knew, their scanner was big enough to do legal size, and that's it. But I have a friend who's a teacher at Texas A&M. He said that at Texas A&M in the map department, the cartography department at A&M, they had a really big scanner that would take a map that was this size. I got together with him, and we made arrangements, and I put this thing in the back of my vehicle all flat with thick plastic on both sides to protect it, because it really just sort of comes apart every time you look at it almost. I headed down to A&M in the summertime after the kids had gone away, and we went to the cartography department, and here was the head of the department. It was right there, and he says, yes, I will scan this thing for you if you'd like. We do have a scanner that will do it. It'll take about an hour to do it because it's really a fine line scan. I said, well, that's fine. And we were talking there in his office, and he says, all right, I've got it going now. And I looked over there, and it was going through these rollers. Yeah, like one of the old-fashioned ringers on a washing machine. And my fragile map was going through those things, and it was too late to pull it back. And it did take about an hour for it to go through. We went off and had coffee and thought about how much of that map was going to be left after it went through those rollers. Anyhow, we came back and he says, all right, the scan is complete and we got a CD, and it just barely fit on one CD. This whole file was on there, and it got him to erase his, so nobody had it but me. Came back to Dallas, driving this fragile little what's left of the map in the back of the car there. And got to Dallas and dropped the CD off at my photo processor and said, look, let's just run a quick picture of this thing as it is, and then we'll see what all we need to do to it. He ran that thing and he called me on the phone. He says, Bill, I don't think there's anything we can do with this. It's got all these white pieces of tape over it and place where Scotch tape was on it. It's got all this. Just don't think there's anything we can do about it. I said, I don't remember it that way. Hold it. Let me come see. So I went over to his place and I got it out and I looked at it, and the head of the cartography department at Texas A&M had to scan the back side of my map. I've heard stories about Texas Aggies all my life, and up until then I thought they were all jokes, but now I know they were all true. So anyhow, I wasn't going to take it back down there. I knew that, but we still wanted to try and get it done. I found a place that would take an 8x10 transparency of it lying flat. And we took the 8x10 transparency, then put it on a drum scanner and did a 4,000 line scan on it. From that, we went in and started filling in all the gaps and the lines and redoing the letter and taking out the smudges and such. And after several hours of work on the computer, we managed to get it cleaned up. And this is the one that we got made of it. And we have made 100 of them. We already sold about 80 of them. So if you want any of them, you better line up there with Pat and see if you can get your money down. But it is really a unique item. There's never going to be another one. Thank you.